Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Fairleigh Dickinson University. My name is Michael Aveltroni. I'm the University Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs here at FDU, and I am delighted to welcome you to an event that I believe will be a very insightful, very meaningful one, a discussion that I think we're lucky expertise on the stage that I will introduce in just a moment. And something that I think is important for us is it speaks to, what we identify as kind of our core mission here of being personal, global, and transformational. I think all three are represented here in the conversation we're going to have on the stage today. Certainly the global aspects as we talk about the geopolitical conflict and talk about, obviously, some of the political context and some of the historical context behind it and some of the relevance to our lives here thousands of miles away, as well as the conversations for sort of the greater world. And I think the personal and the transformational speak to the fact that we're going to be talking about a lot of both of those in the discussions here, both for what it means in geopolitics and in world history, but also for what it means for many of the lives of those who are here, many who are impacted day to day, and for all of us who see this sort of playing out before our very eyes. And I would also speak to the fact that for those of us who are here who are joined by students, it speaks a lot to as well the things that we provide for students to really engage in a lot of these discussions with world scholars, with people who are true leaders in this area. And I'm delighted today to be joined by two of those to my left. I'll be introducing first Jason Scorza. Dr. Scorza is the Vice Provost for International Affairs, and he will be moderating our panel and asking some, I think, very pointed and poignant questions. And he is overseeing much of our international mission here, much of the global focus for our institution, and really leads and has been a great colleague to me in really leading a lot of our academic mission and focus around the global mission of our institution. Equally delighted to be joined by a new colleague who joined the university on July 1st. Dr. Ben Rifkin has joined the institution as our Dean of Becton College of Arts and Sciences. And he has been a tremendous colleague, both in terms of his insights and topics like you'll hear today, but in the common goal of really focusing our mission to be even more student-centered and really focused on the student experience here at FDU and what that looks like in the College of Arts and Sciences and across our disciplines and campuses. And I've been really excited to engage him in a lot of this discussion. But today I get to hear about his passion and his experience and his expertise as he is a scholar of Russian literature, an expert and truly a renowned expert in this area and in Russian language and literature and culture, and brings, I think, a tremendous perspective on this topic and will be very much insightful in the things he offers us as he and Dr. Scorza engage in this conversation. So we're delighted to have both of them here joining all of you. I look forward to the opportunities for you all to listen, to learn, and then to have the opportunity to engage in question and answer as well. And so without further ado, I will turn the floor over to my colleagues, and we look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Provost Aveltroni, and thanks to all of you for joining us here this morning. And thank you, Dr. Rifkin, for participating in what will hopefully be a friendly conversation with perhaps moments of awkwardness. And I'd like to start with one of those because we want to learn, obviously, about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but we also want to learn about you. So I'd first like to ask you, what possessed you to go into the study of Russia? An extremely depressing subject, in my opinion.
So this is not the place or time for me to describe how there's also great joy that can be found in pages of works of Russian literature and in Russian film and other Russian arts, and how I have had wonderful moments of joy and laughter with Russian friends. However, I will say that when I went to college, and for those of you who don't know, I'm originally from Bergen County, When I went to college, I was very clear about what my path was going to be. And Russia was not on that map. I was going to major in history, in particular with a focus on British history, and I was going to go to law school. And in the summer before my sophomore year, I made a decision that I wanted to start a new foreign language. I had studied French very successfully in high school and had taken a French course in college in my first year. I can't help but have a shout out. There's a person with a Yale football cap right there, and when I say college, I mean Yale. I had done well in French in high school and in college, and I thought, maybe I have language aptitude. So I want to take a more challenging language, and I would like to take one that is spoken by people that our country defines as an enemy, because I wanted to understand better people who were being described to me as the enemies of our country. And so I was choosing between Russian and Chinese, and the biggest enemies of the time. And I decided, on more or less a flip of the coin, that I would go to Russian class on the first day of the fall semester of my sophomore year, and on the second day I would go to Chinese. Except I never made it to Chinese. The Russian class was so incredibly amazing, and I decided that this was it. I was going to stay with Russian. By the end of the first month, I barely knew the letters of the alphabet. I had decided to change my major to Russian studies. And by the end of the first semester, I had jettisoned any idea of going to law school and decided that I was going to be a professor of Russian, which is an incredibly naive, romantic, and arrogant thing. I had no idea of the big challenges linguistically that lay ahead of me. I just had this blind confidence that turned out justified that I would be able to be successful in overcoming those challenges. And I just fell head over heels with the study of the language, the culture, the history.
Were you able to visit the Soviet Union while you were a student?
Yeah, so I spent a semester on study abroad in a city that was at the time known as Leningrad, and now it's once again St. Petersburg. So another one of my alma maters is Leningrad State University. Go Bears. I think you could say...
I think they could probably beat Yale, but...
Well, okay, well, not in American football,
Fair
I don't
enough.
think. And I think, you say Go Bears about every Russian university. I don't... So I spent a semester in Leningrad, and it was just absolutely wonderful and utterly transformational, as we say here at Fairleigh Dickinson about so many of the experiences that we want our students to have. And then after I completed my bachelor's and first master's degrees at Yale, I went to Moscow for 2 years and worked as a translator. My primary job, the one that gave me the right to have the equivalent of a green card in the Soviet Union, my residency permit and my permit to work, was working as a translator from Russian to English for a Soviet publishing house. Then my part-time job, which is where I actually spent most of my time in a absolutely accurate reflection of the nature of the Soviet economy. Your real job is something that you just manage to put in your hours at, but that's the job on the books. But where you really put your time and effort and your thinking is the job that actually brings you the income, which is not on the books. I worked for that same period of time, about 2 years, in the Moscow bureau of NBC News, NBC News. And I was translator, interpreter, administrative assistant, and so I went around with the crew and helped them conduct interviews and so forth.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, and when I lived when I was studying in Leningrad and when I was working in Moscow, I also traveled broadly in the Soviet Union, and it was in that time that I visited Ukraine. So I've never been in independent Ukraine, only in Ukraine when it was one of the Soviet Socialist republics.
Right. And do you have any family background in the region?
I do. My paternal ancestors, the ones who brought me my last name, which is an identifiably Russian Jewish name. Rifkin comes from the Hebrew for the name Rebecca, with a Russian adjectival ending. Those ancestors came from the Russian Empire and from the country that is now Belarus.
We could be related.
We could be. We could be. And on another side of my family, I have ancestors who were born in what is now Ukraine, but at the time that they were born was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And when they emigrated just before, less than a year before, or about a year before the Nazis invaded Poland, they emigrated to the United States actually from Poland. The city that they're from is actually a city that you've probably heard of in the news, and it is now called Lviv. So when they were born, it was Lemberg.
So culturally, ancestrally, in terms of your academic studies and professional activities, you've had a foot both in Russia and Ukraine. How, if we can get to the meat of the subject, how do your many perspectives help you understand what is going on and why it's going on?
Thank you. I do want to clarify that although the ancestors I mentioned and others who came from points further west in the European continent came from different polities at the time of their emigration from Europe to the United States, they were all of them ethnically Jews and would not have been considered to be Russian or Ukrainian or Polish by fellow citizens or subjects of those polities at that time.
Citizens of the shtetl.
Right. So, and in fact, with the case of my great-grandfather, Rifkin, and my, I don't know even how to say this, step-great-grandmother, my biological great-grandmother died in childbirth giving birth to my grandfather. And so, as was the custom at the time, the widower would marry, if his dead wife had an unmarried sister, he would marry that unmarried sister. So my step-great-grandmother was also my great-great-aunt, or something like that.
Can we get that up on the screen?
No.
Okay.
So it was thought that, a sister would really love and care for the child. So that's the only mother that my grandfather knew. But at any rate, nobody in our family knows if those ancestors who actually immigrated from the Russian Empire spoke Russian. Here in the United States, they spoke Yiddish, and they gradually learned English. But Yiddish was their native language, as was the case of my other ancestors, that their native language was Yiddish. When approaching the conversation the topic that we're going to be discussing today, lots of people say, how can you be an unbiased, an objective commentator on issues that involve Russia, since you're a professor of Russian?
I would never ask that, although it's in my list of questions.
And so, here I just want to say that professor of Russian is one of my identities. And there are other identities that are more important, and I just want to put them out on my cards on the table for everybody, both here in the room and those streaming. So first and foremost, I'm an American. I am an American, and I look at the world through American perspectives and frameworks, through my particularly American perspective and framework. And I had no better way, there was no better point in my life when I recognized that I am American than when I went to the Soviet Union. Because that's when it really put everything into place for me that so much of how I see the world is defined by my having been born in this country and raised by people in this country and participating in all aspects of American culture, or, most. Roller derby, I don't do. So that was a joke. But, okay.
We'll fix it in post-production.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So you can add laughter there.
That's right.
Yeah, okay. So the second important element of my identity is that I'm a Jew, and I've already mentioned that. And as a Jew so I mentioned to you that one set of grandparents emigrated from what was then Poland to the United States in 1938. All of their family, except for one person, was murdered in the Holocaust. All of them. And I have, I might have had relatives in other countries of Central Europe who would also have all been murdered in the Holocaust. So, I'm somewhat jealous of, I have friends and acquaintances who go to Italy and go to Ireland and go to Norway and have, family reunions with, fifth cousins twice removed kind of thing. I will never have that. I will never have that. And as a Jew, I feel a special obligation to speak out against genocide. And in the case of what is happening now in Ukraine, and the case of what happened in Ukraine in the early 1930s, and I think we'll talk about that later, the word genocide is completely relevant, and the identity of the perpetrators is the government from Moscow. Now, the word Russian itself is very problematic, and I'll talk about that later, because the word Russian in English is what we use to translate two different words from Russian. And the same kind of conundrum comes up with the word Ukrainian. And I'll talk more about that later, about, so what do we mean when we say Russian, or what do we mean when we say Ukrainian? Then the next part of my identity is embedded in the phrase professor of Russian, but it's the first word, professor. Regardless of content, I have a professional and ethical obligation to share with my students in first priority, and with the world as a scholar and researcher in second priority, an objective analysis of what's going on in the world. And so with all of these identities at play, the fact that the culture I study, the language I'm fluent in, other than English, what I wrote my dissertation on, all happen to be related to the Russian language, Russian culture, Russian literature, Russian film. I am here today to talk about a military conflict in this region that the Russian government defines as a special military operation. I will not use that phrase. I will call things as what they are. This is a war against Ukraine. It happens to be in Ukraine, but it is a war against Ukraine. It is a Russian war against Ukraine by the Russian government. I'm going to use that term. And it is a war in which soldiers of the Russian armed forces are perpetrating war crimes and genocide against the people of Ukraine. And in recognition of that fact, I chose my tie very carefully today. And for those of you who are not aware, these are the colors of the Ukrainian flag. And I want to assure you, I have plenty of ties with red, blue, and white in them, which are the colors of the Russian flag, and I am not wearing it today. And in fact, I have lots of little Russian flags that I have removed from my office, and I will not put them out again until there is regime change in the Russian Federation.
There's a lot to unpack in what you've said, and we'll begin doing so now. I would like to point out that I'm also wearing a blue and amber tie, although mine has very small pandas pictured.
And I, speaking, I won't do this in other ways, but at this moment, I'm going to speak out on behalf of Ukrainians and say, pandas are great.
I think so too.
Yeah.
For those of you who are not familiar with the Ukrainian flag, the symbolism of the blue and amber is tremendously important to them. The blue represents the blue sky over the amber fields of wheat, and Ukraine is known as the breadbasket, well, if not of Europe, perhaps even of the world. And what I've simply done is I've populated the fields of wheat with pandas.
With pandas.
Yeah.
Yes, which is where they belong.
Right. To make that segue somewhat more meaningful, we talk a lot in the world of international affairs about hard power and soft power. Hard power being, tanks and missiles and hundreds of thousands of troops storming across borders. Soft power being negotiation, cultural exchange, China is famous for its panda diplomacy as a form of soft power. If you play nice with China, you get pandas for your national zoos. I haven't seen much from Russia in its post-Soviet Union incarnation that suggests an understanding of soft power. I've seen a lot that suggests a very a strong preference for power, power, hard power. Is that part of the sort of the Russian historical makeup, or is this a more recent sort of incarnation or expression of kind of a Russian geopolitical mindset?
I would have to say, not having considered this question before you asked it, my gut instinct is to say that this is a reflection of the Putin regime rather than any historical Russian tendency. And certainly in the Soviet era, maybe this is a good time for me to explain the conundrum in using the English word Russian.
I think so.
For the adjective Russian, the Russian language has two words. One word is Ruski, and Ruski refers to anything that is ethnically Russian. So a person whose name is Vladimir Ivanov, who is from Perm, a small city in Siberia, who speaks Russian at home and thinks of himself as Russian. He speaks Ruski, the language. He identifies as Ruski, and in his internal passport, next to the word nationalnost, it says Ruskaya, or Ruski, that he is ethnically Russian. If we were to take another person whose first name could also sound very Russian, could be somebody whose name is Vladimir, which is a Russian version of the same name that the president of Ukraine has. In Ukrainian, it's Volodymyr. In a footnote, as a fluent speaker of Russian who does not speak Ukrainian, I apologize in advance that any Ukrainian words or names I may say may have a Russian accent. So, because I haven't started to learn Ukrainian yet. So, this fellow, Vladimir, may have a Russian last name, but he is Tatar, which is another ethnic group in the Russian Empire, in the Soviet Union, in the Russian Federation. And he may speak Russian, he may also speak Tatar, but not necessarily. And he and the other Vladimir, who is ethnically Russian, in their passports under citizenship, it says Россияnin. So for nationality, Vladimir, who's the Tatar, it doesn't say Ruski, it says Tatarin. But citizenship, they're both Россияnin. So the adjective for Russian that refers to the government, the state, without an ethnic imposition is Rossiyskiy, having to do with Россия, which is the name of the country. And that whole word, Russia, and this would be a good time for us to go to the other map, if whoever could do that. So I'm going to stand here and point. So there are people documented as living in this area as early as around the 5th century. And it's a very important place. You can see that the river goes down to the Black Sea, and then you know that south of the Black Sea would have been, at this period of time, Constantinople, access to the Mediterranean, Rome, Italy, and also from here, one can get over here, and then a little bit on land, and then or a little bit up here, and then over here, and down to the Caspian Sea, and then this is a way that you can get even to India. So as a trade place, this is a great location. And so there were some people up north of Stockholm in the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries who started moving south, exploring some places, conquering lands, and we've come to call them Vikings. And a group of them who came from particularly north of Stockholm, the Vikings actually not just north of Stockholm, but all across the southern shores of Scandinavia. So a group of them from north of Stockholm in an area that was called by Finns something like Ruosi, started to explore this area and came further and further south. And one of them, a man by the name of Rurik, who was a prince, led a group that conquered Kiev. And because the Finns called this group Rus, the polity that grew up around the center, with its center at Kiev, came to be called Kievan Rus.
Is that why some people, even to this day, claim that Ukraine is Russia?
Yes, and it gets more interesting.
Well, that's pretty interesting.
Okay,
Right.
so the people who lived in this time were not, and in this area, were of mixed Scandinavian, Slavic, and Finnic and Turkic descent. So there's this real mix of people. But the rulers, who were all Scandinavian, and by the way, in what is one of the most important historical precedents in the history of the Russian-speaking peoples, is the notion that Rurik did not invade and occupy Kiev, but rather he was invited, as were the Soviet tanks to Prague in 1968, and the Soviet tanks to Afghanistan in 1979, 1980. So this notion of the invitation goes back that far for the Russians. So the area, the people who lived at this time of the preliminary Scandinavian Viking invasion occupation were not Russians, were not Ukrainians. They were Slavs. And they spoke a language that ultimately evolved into other Slavic languages, including Russian and Ukrainian and Belarusian. So that comes much later. And the history of this region is not at all Russian until Peter the Great, and in Russian, ironically, he's not called Great, he's called Peter the First. Peter the Great had numerous expansionist wars, and one of which was against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which occupied this area. So what was in this period before, so first we have the state of Kievan Rus, which is somewhat Scandinavian Slavic, and the Slavs wind up the Vikings wind up taking on Slavic names, and the whole culture becomes Christian in the late 10th century. And so the region is Slavicized. Then there's a period where it's occupied by Turkic-speaking peoples, sometimes referred to as Tatars, sometimes referred to as Mongols. And then the area comes under the control of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Later, Peter the Great seizes what is eastern Ukraine, we also call it left bank Ukraine, with an understanding that, and we'll see it better on the next map. So why don't we switch to the next map now, if we could? The darker green is the darker green is, I'm sorry, I didn't see this before today, is the 2015 map of Ukraine, and I would argue that Crimea, which is cut off over here, actually should be green as well. We'll get to that. So this river is a very defining river. It's the Dnieper or Dnipro river, and it goes north-south, and this is considered the left bank, and this is the right bank because you're looking at it from the source of the river, so you're looking down. So the left bank is eastern Ukraine, and the right bank is western Ukraine. So all of this was occupied by Peter the Great and became part of the Russian Empire. And much later, much of this became part of the Russian Empire under the time of Catherine the Great, also not called the Great in Russian, Catherine II. And so historically, all of Ukraine comes into the Russian Empire only around in the era of Catherine the Great. And there's a brief period of Ukrainian independence right around the time of the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War of 1917 to 1920 or so. And then once again, Ukraine is split, with part of it in the Soviet Union and part of it in Poland, until the Soviet invasion of Poland and Ukraine in 1939, when the Soviet Union was allied with Nazi Germany. And at that point, Ukraine becomes fully part of the Soviet Union. It is, of course, fully occupied by the Nazis during World War II, but ultimately, in the peace settlement of 1945, Ukraine completely enters into the Soviet Union with roughly this map. Ultimately, Crimea is moved from the Russian Federation to Ukraine in 1954, and that then becomes the boundaries of Ukraine as legally and diplomatically recognized by the world and the Russian Federation by treaty, international treaty, in 1991 and subsequently.
I don't know where to
Sorry.
begin. No. But warn me next time you get 1,500 years.
Sorry.
In 7.5 minutes. I want to stick on the World War II, well, post-Russian Revolution through World War II era, as fascinating as 5th century, Central Europe might be. Perhaps the more relevant signifiers are the more recent ones. So when the Bolsheviks took control of Russia and other areas, they were very hostile to the concept of pan-Slavism, which might have been a way of thinking about the unification of everyone from Romania to Russia itself, Ukraine, Belarus. They didn't believe in that, or at least they claim not to believe in that.
There's far more nuance to it than that, and let me see if I can do it in less than 7.5 minutes. There's a falsehood in claiming that there's some sort of Soviet position or perspective on anything. And let me just give you a personal example of this. This is a digression, and I apologize, but I think you'll find it interesting. When I was working in Moscow as a translator, I was given a book to translate by what was then the equivalent of our Secretary of State, Andrei Gromyko. And I translated his book, and I submitted it for publication. And then Gromyko went to Reykjavik and had some kind of big negotiation with Schultz, who was our George Schultz, who was our Secretary of State at the time. And they came up with an agreement. And so that actually was completely opposite from what Gromyko had written in his book that I had just translated. So the book was removed from publication. And so I go to the publishing house office one day, looking to get paid for the book that I translated. And they said, "How can you get paid for a book that no longer exists?" And so there you have, Soviet political philosophy and ideology, right? So
It's a Dostoevskian moment.
Right. And, it's very much, a good Soviet citizen, finds out what his opinion is in tomorrow's edition of Pravda. And that can be said also, by the way, of a good citizen of the Russian Federation in tomorrow's edition of Izvestia. So, what I would say about Soviet positions on nationalities is that they changed dramatically throughout the Soviet era. And one of the things that was that marked the very beginning of the establishment of the Soviet Union in 1922 was the establishment of ethnic republics. And there was a period until the rise of Stalin in which some of the cultures of the peoples of the Soviet Empire were given official status and favored, and there were actual financial resources dedicated to the establishment of schools, the publication of books. Ukrainian was one of the favored languages. Right. And so there's this brief window where Ukrainian culture flowers, and part of this is happening in the context of the fact that before the revolution, there was a part of Ukraine, and it happens to be the part that this part over here, that one set of my grandparents are from, that was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the people who lived there under Habsburg rule had it great. So they had Ukrainian schools, they had Ukrainian papers, newspapers, they had Ukrainian cultural education, they lived their lives in Ukrainian. And the integration of that population would ultimately prove problematic for the Soviet Union. But that's part of Ukraine at the beginning of the Soviet experiment.
Was there a distinct Ukrainian literary tradition?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's important to understand that in the Russian Empire, Ukrainian and Belarusian were not considered to be languages. They were considered to be dialects, and they were suppressed. In a way that you might hear someone who has just started to study English and makes a lot of mistakes, but you know that with enough education they'll get it right. Well, that's how many Russians viewed people who spoke Ukrainian and Belarusian. And so this is very problematic for people who are Ukrainian and Belarusian, and they develop their own sense of inferiority. And so to this day, there are people who identify as Ukrainian and who are now struggling to speak Ukrainian because they spent their whole lives, their educations, growing up using Ukrainian only in the home and never to talk about anything professional. And so Ukrainian literature in the Russian Empire could not exist. There were laws passed prohibiting the publication of books in Ukrainian. And by the way...
That would have been the case for Yiddish as well.
Yes. Yiddish had a special layer of attention that, we should save for another time.
Okay.
Tom Lehrer, has this song called National Brotherhood Week, in which the refrain is, "And everyone hates the Jews." Yeah. So, that's where the Yiddish...
he means it ironically.
He means it ironically, yes. But so, going back to the question of suppression of languages, the Ukrainians didn't have spectacularly notable rebellions against the Russian imperial government, but the Poles did. And in the 18th century, Poland was partitioned 3 times and removed from the map. It ceased to exist. And just to give you an example, the 3rd largest city in the Russian Empire on the eve of World War I was Warsaw. And with each rebellion of the Poles, and there were 3 or 4 major rebellions against the Russian Empire, all of them brutally suppressed. The Russian government has historically been very good at that. The education in Polish was prohibited, publication in Polish was prohibited, and so Ukrainian was not nearly as vibrant a language in its resources as Polish at this time, and so it was much easier for the Russian Empire to suppress Ukrainian than Polish. The Soviet Union supported Ukrainian and Belarusian and helped the publication of grammars and so forth, but made it very clear that to have any kind of professional success in the Soviet Union meant to do that in Russian. And that would be the case also for Uzbeks and Armenians and so forth.
Interesting. The pretext, I think we can call it pretext, for invasion is multifold. There was the invitation pretext, Russian-speaking people in Ukraine being, repressed and abused by the Ukrainian government, needed to be rescued by Russia. Similar pretext was used by Nazi Germany as an excuse for invading autonomous, independent countries. There was the pretext also of history, which we've touched on quite a bit. whether we want to go back to the 5th century or not, there were periods of time when Ukraine was, if not part of Russia, subject to Russian rule. Then there's this whole language which baffles me of denazification, the idea that Ukraine, including its government, is riddled with Nazis that must be rooted out in order to save, not only Ukraine, Russia, the entire world. On the face of it, that's crazy. Is there any way of looking at that? Is there any historical basis for making claims like that, whatever the reality of the current situation may be?
Thank you for asking this question.
I withdraw the question. No.
Thank you for asking this question. And so you raised three justifications that Putin and his government have.
Pretexts.
Pretexts.
I won't give them credit for.
Thank you. I'm going to stick with the word pretext. 3 pretexts. I'll add a 4th, and then I'll debunk them all and tell you what I think is the real reason that Putin decided to invade Ukraine.
Okay.
Okay. So the 4th one, and those of you most of you here in the room are seated, so you won't fall over. Those of you who are standing, could you grab onto something? Because this is going to really shock you, okay?
And those of you at home,
please sit
if
down.
there are children present, no.
To save the world from gay people. Okay, that's the 4th justification. Okay, so now I'm going to go and debunk pretext. So now I'm going to go and debunk all the pretexts. Okay.
In historical order or alphabetical?
And I'm going to do them in the order you asked.
Okay.
Okay. So first, I just want to talk about the map. So historically, so we have to understand that Ukraine has had very little time as an independent nation, and having an independent nation is a circumstance. History doesn't come with destinies. Things happen for all kinds of reasons, and we wind up with a nation state, right? I mean, look at the map of Africa. Some people in Europe got together and said, all right, we'll draw the borders here. And that's how we got the map of Africa that we see today. Does that reflect the cultural communities that live on the African continent? Not at all. The same thing with Poland. Poland was a kingdom, became a commonwealth in union with Lithuania, then was wiped off the face of the map of Europe, then was recreated, and then the whole country was shifted west. So these things are arbitrary, but for some strategic political decisions made by the Continental and British armies in the 18th century, we might not be an independent country here, or we might be part of Greater Canada. Who knows? At any rate, there's a certain amount of chance, and we can't look at history as something like, well, it was always destined to be this way. So when we look at Ukraine, and I just want you to be sure to include this part as Ukraine, we have to understand that this is a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multicultural state. So while Ukrainian is by far the majority, both ethnic identity and language, historically we've had people in this region speaking not only Ukrainian and Russian and Polish, but also Tatar, and again I want to call attention to this region, Tatar, because this region was the homeland of the Crimean Tatars.
There were even Greek-speaking people.
Greek-speaking people, Romanian-speaking people, Yiddish-speaking people, of course, German-speaking people, and Latvian and Lithuanian-speaking people, among others. And to this day, Ukraine is a very multilingual and multicultural state. And here is, I mentioned earlier, the challenge. Oh, I need to say one other thing before I sit down. The challenge of talking about Ukraine. Ukraine is a multilingual, multi-ethnic, multicultural country. And so we have people who identify as citizens of Ukraine, but who may not identify as Ukrainian, ethnically. They'll identify as Ukrainian as a citizen, but not ethnically. So in terms of Russian speakers, before the full-scale invasion of 2022, of February, starting in 2014, when Russia began to invade this region over here. This is the region with the densest population, and over here, it's the south and the east that has the densest population of Russian speakers. What is the part of Ukraine that has been most decimated by this war? Who are the people who have suffered most in this military, in this horrible, horrible invasion? Who are the people who have been killed and tortured the most? It is precisely the Russian speakers. So the idea of rescuing the Russian speakers is laughable were it not so tragic, because these are the people who have suffered the most in the invasion. And many people who were Russian speakers are now, this is a very significant cultural trend of people who are Russian speakers rejecting the Russian language and shifting into Ukrainian full-time. They don't want to speak Russian anymore. So the second pretext, and Putin's government and his government-controlled media stations were claiming that the Ukrainian government was literally crucifying Russian-speaking children in Ukraine. Literally crucifying. And they showed pictures that they created of children nailed up on crosses. So that's the first pretext. The second pretext...
was that at various times Ukraine was actually part of Russia,
or that Ukraine is truly Russian.
Yeah.
Right. And Putin, shortly before the invasion, published an essay called "Russia and Ukraine are historically united." And this is another map point. So when we talk about the cultural differences between countries or cultures, the significant difference, this region over here, its primary historical influence in determining, what it is, was Tatar occupation. This part of Ukraine over here, completely integrated into the European experience, whether part of Poland, Lithuania, part of the Habsburg Empire. Ukraine is fundamentally part of Europe and European history. Russia had no Renaissance. Russia had no Enlightenment. Russia had no Reformation. Russia had no Counter-Reformation. Ukraine participated in all of these European historical phenomena.
There was a period of sort of Francophilia, though. Was there not?
There was Germanophilia in the 18th century, Francophilia in the first part of the 19th century, which shifted to Anglophilia. But the structure of leadership and the nature of the civilization is far more connected to the Tatar legacy than it is to the trends of European history. And Ukraine fully participated in those trends. Right. Yeah. So the third question is, the third pretext is the accusation that the Ukrainian government is Nazi in its orientation and that there are many Nazis in Ukraine. And you know how sometimes some people will, because they are afraid that you will accuse them of, they will be accused of X, they're going to accuse their opponents and enemies of X?
It's well established that autocrats will accuse others of the vices that they're most intimately familiar with.
Okay.
This
So,
does not apply to deans or vice
thank you.
provosts.
Well,
No.
I don't consider myself or you an autocrat.
Thank you.
So, okay. So here I just want to point out that, that the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation consider the most important event of the 20th century in terms of Russian national identity to be the defeat of Hitler. And they talk about this nonstop, and they refer to the war that we call the Second World War as the Great Patriotic War. But when you look at the information that they provide about the Great Patriotic War, they note that it began in 1941 and ended in 1945. They don't want to talk about what happened.
The Hitler-Stalin Pact.
Right, between
invasion of
1939 and
Poland.
1941, right? So that's the period of time from August of 1939 until Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. That's the period of time when the Soviet Union was Nazi Germany's biggest, most important ally. So the Soviet Union and its inheritor state, the Russian Federation, don't want to talk about 1939 to 1941. And in fact, Stalin signing that agreement with Hitler is what unleashed the war. Because if he hadn't done that, Hitler might have hesitated about whether or not to invade Poland.
Well, he would regret having a double-flanked war.
Right, at that moment.
Yeah.
And so actually the Soviet Union was Hitler's biggest ally in the period 1939 to 1941 that made the conflagration and potentially the Holocaust possible. That's number one. Number two, during the phase of the conflict in which the Soviet Union was allied with the United States, Britain, and France against Hitler after Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, during that period, there was a nearly 1 million person strong army of Russian Soviet citizens who collaborated with the Nazis under the command of a man by the name of Vlasov. So in order to deflect attention from these things, the Soviet Union and the Russians call attention to some Ukrainians who collaborated with the Nazis. Now, I want to set the historical context for this. I defy any of you watching, to name a country occupied by the Nazis that did not have any collaborators. Every single country occupied by the Nazis had collaborators. And there are collaborators with the Russians in Russian-occupied Ukraine right now. There are collaborators. That's just kind of what happens in a time of war. There are reasons why Ukrainians, having been invaded by the Nazis, might have thought this was a good thing. And we haven't mentioned this, and it's very important to mention. After Stalin came to full power in 1929, he embarked on an economic plan of forced collectivization of Soviet agriculture, which created a man-made famine in Ukraine that killed millions and millions of people, more than were killed in the Holocaust. This famine, which we observed the 90th anniversary of last week, because it began in 1932, is called Holodomor in Ukrainian, which means death by hunger in Ukrainian. And so this was a purposeful extermination, a genocide against the Ukrainian people. And it's important to understand it as a genocide, as many countries in Europe are beginning to recognize it as such. By the way, it wasn't merely a crop failure. Food was removed from Ukraine, and the borders of Ukraine were sealed. And I'm not talking only about the borders of Ukraine with countries to the west. I'm talking about the internal borders, so that if you were a Ukrainian peasant, you couldn't get into Belarus, the Belarusian Republic, or the Russian Republic. Those borders were sealed. So this is an attempt at genocide of the Ukrainian people. So you're being killed by the Soviets, and the Germans come. Now, you've been hearing horrible propaganda about the Germans, but, you know, they were okay in World War I when the Germans occupied Ukrainian territory. You know, one imperial lord for another. So, you know, the guys you got in Moscow are terrible. Maybe Berlin will be better. So I will not stand in judgment of Ukrainians who decided at first to collaborate with the Nazis, not knowing the evil that had befallen them. And they were still smaller in number. And so after the war, the Soviet Union made a very big deal of identifying Ukrainian nationalism with Nazi collaboration. And this became the pretext for the suppression of Ukrainian national movements throughout the rest of Soviet history, which had a perverse effect of encouraging Ukrainian national sentiment. Now, in terms of, you know, are there Nazis in Ukraine today? There are Nazis everywhere. There are Nazis here in this country. However, the number of Nazis in Ukraine now is far smaller, percentage-wise, than the number of Nazis in Germany, in France, in Italy, in the United States, and in Russia itself. And the idea that the president of Ukraine, who is a Jew, whose uncles were murdered in the Holocaust would be a Nazi is something I find, and many Ukrainians find, very offensive. And then the last pretext is we have to save the world from the gays. And this is just resonating with Putin's support of what he calls traditional Russian family values.
Real Russians.
Real Russians, right? Real Russians are not gay. The idea of a gay pride parade in a country near you could be somehow offensive. And I remember thinking that, in our country, when one of the earliest states to establish marriage equality was Massachusetts. And I asked a gay friend of mine a year later or so, and we didn't have marriage equality in the whole country, and some states were following yet, but maybe not very many. And I said, there are a lot of people who are saying that, gay marriage, if we allow gay marriage, that, civilization will collapse. And I said, so how is Massachusetts these days? Are people running amok in the streets, naked and firing guns in all directions? And the answer is no, Massachusetts is pretty much the same. The divorce rate has gone down, So I'm just not afraid of a gay pride parade or gay marriage. So what is the real reason that Putin decided to invade Ukraine? And here it is, folks. Ukraine is more threatening to Putin than Taiwan is to China. A prosperous, democratic, and European Ukraine on the border of the Russian Federation, which is a wholly owned enterprise of Vladimir Putin. He is the richest man in the world. Puts at risk his wealth and his security. He cannot allow Ukraine to be sovereign, independent, free, and European. And he thought he pulled off that fix when he put Yanukovych in the presidency. And when Yanukovych flirted with the idea of signing an agreement to become a member, for Ukraine to become a member of the European Union, and then said, no, I'm going to join this Eurasian thing that Putin is sponsoring instead, people came out onto the streets. At first, it was teenagers and young adults, and then they were joined by their parents. And the protest grew into a revolution. The revolution of dignity is what we call it, and what Ukrainians call it in Ukrainian. And we also refer to it as the revolution on the Maidan. And Maidan means, Maidan is a central square in Kyiv. It's the square, it's Independence Square. It's a beautiful space. And tens and at one point hundreds of thousands of people came out, and they toppled the regime. And Yanukovych fled to Russia and was exposed in the following days with enormous corruption. So Putin tried to steer Ukraine's government in one direction and failed. And it was soon after that that he began sparking the military conflict in the Donbass region, which is that northeast region that I pointed out, and seized Crimea.
So the political science part of my brain wants to resist personalizing geopolitical events.
Mine too.
So it's easy, in the news media. Putin did this, Putin did that, Putin did that. Why is Putin? What is Putin thinking? As if that is the full, sort of key to understanding. And I think what you've spoken about today, historically, clearly shows that there are more things going on. So I'm going to ask you an unfair question and perhaps ask you to speculate. When the Russian forces, setting aside the annexation of Ukraine several years back, when the Russian forces...
The annexation of Crimea?
Yeah.
Okay.
Moved into Ukrainian territory last year.
You mean February of this year?
Was it February of this year?
Yeah.
Time flies.
It does, okay.
Was there a strategic objective? That I still don't understand. You know, a strategic objective might have been to annex some additional territory. If they had done that, they could have declared victory in 15 minutes and everyone would, you know, wring their hands, but that would have been it. Was it to send a message? Was it to topple the regime? That was the goal, to replace the current democratically elected government with a puppet government.
Right. So, couple things. First, I tend to agree with you that, or not I tend, I agree with you that in general, causes of events in history are more complicated than one particular individual. But in this case, that's not the case. Putin is what we can call a personal autocrat. So if he were to die today, and one of the ways you can tell, if he were to die today, like he's walking out the street and a truck mows him down, he has a heart attack, whatever. No one knows who would come up to power next or what that person's, policies would be. No one. He is a personal autocrat. And by the way, at one point in his over 20 years of leadership of this country, he changed the Constitution, or he put through changes to the Constitution to change how governors of regions, which are enormous swaths of territory, are appointed. They became appointed instead of elected. And the way to become a governor of a region in Russia is to have first served as one of Putin's bodyguards. That's, you look at those governors and they're former bodyguards of Putin himself. So this is a personal autocracy. And his goal, because it is appropriate to talk about Putin's goal in this war, was to topple the Ukrainian regime and bring Ukraine into the Russian Federation, or in a second case, best scenario, to establish a puppet regime like the one he has in Belarus to this day with Lukashenko. And Zelensky, before the invasion, was not particularly popular. So he won election with 73% of the vote, which is an enormous showing. Imagine the United States if any president of recent history would have won with 73%. It boggles the mind to think about that. And also 73% of Ukrainian voters voted for a Jew who speaks Russian, by the way. Zelensky grew up speaking Russian in his home, as is the case for many Jews of Ukraine. So it's just remarkable that he had that great support at the time of the election, and not remarkable that after the election, his support would decline as people become dissatisfied. But right now, I think he's probably, if there would be a poll, he'd be at like 99.7%, with the other 0.3% being, people who are crazy. Just Ukrainians love their president, and Putin had the belief that the Ukrainian army would collapse in 3 days. He would be in Kyiv. But in fact, what he did was he has brought Finland and Sweden into a position where they will be joining NATO. He's brought Ukraine closer to being part of the European Union and being part of NATO. He has united the West, and he has united Ukraine against Russia.
Does he have an exit strategy that is not A, personally humiliating, and B, nationally humiliating? And I think that second part of the question is also tremendously important, because the war initially was outrageously popular, and not just because of propaganda, but because it spoke to, Russia being strong again, Russia being important again, Russia overcoming humiliation after humiliation after humiliation. That resonated, right? Is there any way out for him other than to slip on a bar of soap and bash his brains out?
So, first I want to speak about the issue of popular support for the war. We have no way of knowing how popular this war is. there is no way to trust any polling coming out of the Russian Federation. If I were a citizen of the Russian Federation and, I don't know, Galupski, called me up on the phone. That was a joke, by the way. I'll let you know when I'm joking. Galupski
They
calls
may have heard of Horowitzki.
Okay, Horowitzki. Calls me up on the, or, fairly ski Dickinsky,
Yeah.
calls me up on the phone and says, so what do you think about the war? I'm hanging up. Because being arrested in the Russian Federation brings with it a 98% likelihood of being convicted. And even if you're convicted and sentenced to a short period of time in prison, that could wind up being fatal. So Russia actually doesn't have a death penalty. It was eliminated. But that doesn't mean that a lot of people don't die in prison, and sometimes with the intention of prison staff. It's just not legally sanctioned, but it happens. So the fear of going to prison is very reasonable in the context of the Russian Federation, and the people who are protesting are demonstrating incredible courage, just incredible courage. When Navalny got on the plane to go back to Russia, knowing that he would be met at the airport and taken straight to prison, he's not one of my favorite people, for what he stands for in terms of his political views. But I have to hand it to him that he's demonstrated remarkable moral courage. So we really have no way of knowing how much of what percentage of the population in any particular region of the Russian Federation support this war. And I want to point out that it's mostly being fought by people who are not ethnically Russians. So we talk about the Russian armed forces, but the young men who are dying are not having, their bodies are not being brought back to Moscow and St. Petersburg. They're going back to Dagestan. They're going back to Ingushetia. They're going back to Bashkiria. These are regions of the country that are primarily Muslim. And Islam, by the way, is the second largest religious tradition in the Russian Federation. So I will take a pass on saying whether or not the war is truly popular. The media will have us believe
at the beginning.
At the beginning, and again, maybe certainly the media will have us believe that, and the media are state-controlled, but the people will accept any resolution that is brought to them by the state. So if Putin or any other leader of the Russian Federation were to say, we have won, we've achieved our goals, the war is over, the people would not accept that as a humiliation.
Yeah.
So that will be fine.
Okay.
How does Putin get out of this? I see no way. And one of the things that I ask many of my friends in the field is this: okay, I can, and probably you can, imagine Ukraine after the war. It is easy for me to imagine Ukraine after the war. I cannot imagine Russia after this war. I just can't. I can't. It is possible that the economic drain on the country is so great that some people will take Putin out. Putin is old enough that he could die of natural causes at any time. There are all kinds of rampant speculations about he's got Parkinson's, he's got cancer, he's got this, he's got that. I don't know. I don't think that the next person to come to power after him will be a progressive Democrat who seeks to join NATO and become and lead the Russian Federation to become a democracy. But it would be a real easy win to end the war, get sanctions removed, and get the economy going so that people feel happier in their day-to-day existence. So just in terms of the economy, the sanctions are huge, and the impact on the Russian economy is only going to get worse. By the way, recently they stopped train service between two major cities in the Russian Federation because they don't have enough spare parts for the trains. And they've decided...
That sounds like New Jersey Transit.
Trust me, it's not like New Jersey Transit in any way. And because they want to focus the trains on the cities that are more important.
Right.
So, and the same thing is going to begin to happen soon with planes. And there's also an enormous impact on other aspects of the economy when an enormous percent of the GDP of the Russian Federation is dedicated to the military, the funding of the military in this war. And the soldiers of the Russian Federation are being killed by the thousands. The death rate is far greater than Afghanistan.
Yeah. Oh, very much so. And you know, and we're going to move to Q&A in just a moment. You know a country's in trouble when it's rearming itself with purchases from North Korea.
Yeah.
Which is what's happening right now.
That is exactly what's happening now. And the other thing that I would say about this is that there's increasing resistance from the people living in the ethnic areas whose sons are dying at the highest rates. Right. And this essentially is another kind of genocide, right? So we've got Dagestanis who are being murdered on the fields of Ukraine by Ukrainian soldiers because the Russian government, the government in Moscow, has called them up to try to avoid ethnic Russian protest in Moscow and St. Petersburg. But Dagestani mothers are protesting. So we could very likely see unrest in numerous regions of the Russian Federation. And we are already seeing increasing distancing from several countries of the former Soviet Union from alliances with Moscow. And that would include Kazakhstan, which has made several important moves politically away from Moscow, also Uzbekistan, also Armenia, which is quite striking given Russia's role in supporting the Armenian Orthodox population in its ongoing conflict with Azerbaijan.
And of course, Republic of Georgia has been resistant to Russian influence from practically the moment of independence.
Yes, and that was certainly enhanced when the Putin invaded northern Georgia in 2008.
And there's still
there are
some occupying forces.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I'd like to invite members of the audience who would like to ask Dean Rifkin a question to proceed to the microphone in the center aisle. And while you organize yourselves in that regard, I have one more question, hopefully with a short answer.
I'll try.
Ukrainians get very angry when their country is referred to as the Ukraine rather than Ukraine. Why?
So Ukrainian, like Russian and almost all other Slavic languages, for those of you interested, Bulgarian is the exception, don't have articles. So they don't, Ukrainian and Russian and Polish don't have words like the and a. And the use of the with the word Ukraine reflects a Russian imperial view of Ukraine as an area. For instance, where are you going next weekend? I'm going to the Catskills. I'm going to the Poconos. It's a region.
Going down the shore.
Going down the shore. It's a region. And Ukraine wants to be recognized as a country, and I believe it deserves to be recognized as a country. And so Ukraine doesn't want English speakers to use the word the. And here I just want to point out that we in America have changed how we refer to countries and cities around the world based on the requests of those countries and cities. So I think I was in high school, maybe early college, when word came out that the capital of China would no longer be called Peking, but would be Beijing. And we made that change, and that was respectful of the people of China who wanted to have the name of the city reflect the sound of the name that they are used to. And so too, we've changed the spelling of the name of the capital of Ukraine from Kiev, which is a transliteration from Russian, to Kyiv, which is a transliteration directly from Ukrainian. Because why should we speak about that country only through the filter of its imperial occupier? And that was how we got to the Ukraine. and that is why I talk about how I look forward to visiting Ukraine after the war.
Please, sir, if you would introduce yourself and ask your question.
My name is Rich Kushner, and I would like to thank you, Professor, for imparting your comprehensive knowledge of the history behind the conflict today. And I'd like to ask your opinion if we can draw parallels between what's occurring today with the events during World War I and the overthrow of Tsar Nicholas and the consequences that followed.
It's a great question. In answering it, I just want to call your attention to those of you who are interested in getting a sense of how Russian media are talking about the war in Ukraine and don't speak Russian, but use Twitter. There's a person by the name of Julia Davis, and she has a Twitter account that might be something like @JuliaDavisNews, and Julia spelled just like you would spell Julia, and Davis the way you think it's spelled. So @JuliaDavisNews, and she takes clips from Russian news shows, discussions, and she puts English captions on them, and then she posts them with her own commentary, and she's very smart, and she's taking really interesting clips. And one of the clips that she posted recently had some Russian commentators talking about how after every war, Russia only gets stronger, and the comment was about the defeat of Napoleon and the defeat of Hitler. And Julia pointed out in her comment, but there are other wars to think about as well. The Crimean War, World War I, the Crimean War, the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, and World War I. So I'm going to talk about those three. The Crimean War was Russia's first military defeat in centuries, and it was shocking to the Russian Empire, and which had only several years prior participated in brutal suppressions of revolutionary movements in Central and Central Europe, and very successfully. The Crimean War was a defeat, and right around the time that the war was ending and the defeat occurred, the Tsar at the time died, and a new Tsar came to power, Tsar Alexander II. In Russian, he's called Alexander the Liberator, who felt that the defeat in the Crimean War demonstrated that there were significant issues with Russian society that had to be addressed, and he brought about absolutely tremendous legal and social change in the Russian Empire, including the emancipation of the serfs, which happened in 1861, a couple of years before the Emancipation Act here in the United States, and also a host of other reforms in education and healthcare, and trials by jury were introduced. And so the response to that war was reform, and it was tremendous. Then there was the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, which was a crushing defeat for the Russian Empire and was shocking because this was the first time since the initial losses in the Middle Ages to the Tatar invaders that Russia was defeated by a non-European country. They had been defeated by Europeans in the Crimean War. Now they were defeated by Japanese, and at that time, in European culture, as well as American, it was very, very popularly believed that white Europeans were racially superior to non-Europeans. And there was this whole Darwinian hierarchy of which races were superior to others, and the Japanese were definitely lower on the scale than the Russians. And that defeat sparked a revolution which compelled the Tsar at the time, Nicholas II, Russia's last Tsar, to concede democratic reforms, including the creation, for the first time in Russian history, of a parliament. And there were a number of other reforms that were quite progressive, but they didn't last. Within 3 years, they were either eliminated or weakened. And then during World War I, the Russian Empire just collapsed. We use the term, talking about history, of the Russian Revolution. There were two key events that happened, and I wouldn't call either one of them a revolution. The first one was the collapse of the Russian imperial government, which led to the establishment of a provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, and that government was probably one of the most progressive governments in the world at its time, and probably now would still be considered one of the most progressive in its time, especially with regard to things like women's rights. But it wasn't a revolution so much as a collapse. And then in October, it was November 7th on our calendar, October 25th of 1917 on the Russian calendar, that there was a Bolshevik coup. And that's also referred to as a revolution, but I prefer to think of it as a coup, which brought the Bolshevik fraction of the Communist Party to power. I think that this war could, when I say this war, I mean Russia's war on Ukraine, could ultimately lead to some kind of coup. It is hard for me to imagine a revolution in Russia, and I'm not sure that there's ever been one. Well, the 1905 revolution was truly a revolution, I'll go with that. But it had limited impact. The revolutions of 1917 were a collapse of government, followed by an abdication, and a coup, followed by a civil war. I could definitely see a coup happening. I just don't know who could be involved. And I don't know what would push people over the edge for that, and I don't know who are the people who could be pushed over the edge.
What about continued military setbacks, turning the heads of the military?
Certainly, that's a very likely scenario of anybody who would be involved. It's just that there is such an entrenched intelligence/security force. So one of the things that Putin has done that's very similar to Stalin is that Putin has established several different competing intelligence sectors that report up to him separately. And so they're all spying on one another. And so, if you decide, let's say that you're a general and you think, this is ridiculous. We got to stop this. I got to find another general, and together we'll, march on Moscow, or together we'll take Putin out. It's hard for me to imagine how any two people can gather in a room without a third who's going to be reporting up to Putin. So that's my difficulty in understanding. So in the United States we have a directorate of intelligence that I think is meant to be unified after the demonstrated failures that allowed 9/11 to happen, because the FBI wasn't talking to the CIA, wasn't talking to the NSA, wasn't talking to Army intelligence, so forth. So now we, in theory, have a unified command for intelligence. Putin doesn't have that. He has, different people reporting up to him. So,
Interesting.
hard to see that happening. And that's the same
Thank
pattern
you.
that Stalin had.
Who would like to ask the next question? Let me see.
Maybe I could suggest an explanation.
If you would like to go to the microphone, you may.
Let me just put this Yale cap on to make me feel a little at home.
Oh, thank you.
It's a funny story, this Yale cap. Just a side light, my brother-in-law calls me and said, Bobby get into Harvard, but Larry get into Yale. And both guys are identical twins, and they're 6'3", 240, built like brick houses. And so they both go to Yale because the coach says, you come here, I'll make sure you play. So, and you'll make the team. So they made the team, and they start sophomore year. One plays linebacker, one plays outside linebacker. And the announcer said, tackle by A-Bear, tackle by A-Bear, tackle by A-Bear. And this guy, 2 Yale alumni are sitting behind me and said, boy, this kid A-Bear's all over the place. Little did they know there are 2 of them. They're twins. And those guys were great. They one got drafted by the chief, and one was captain his senior year.
If you could segue that story to a question about Russia,
Yes.
I'll
Ukraine.
I'll buy you lunch.
Or Ukraine.
Well, one now is fighting in the Ukrainian army, I'm only kidding. You mentioned that I wrote that Professor Rifkin sees no out for Putin in this war. But then you think, well, how does it end? If Putin does not have an out. And that's my first question. My second question is a non-military person in America, we are allegedly sending a lot of military hardware to the Ukraine to beat Russia, but some of this is not long-range things that can't reach the Russians. And so I don't know, are we doing the right thing? And if so, are we doing it right? So those are my 2 questions.
Okay.
As a military strategist, well, no, as a Russian studies specialist, can you answer that?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I want to go back to the first question, which I already forgot. Can
No,
you
the
say that
fir-
one again?
the
Oh,
first-
is there
there's no,
how does the war end?
Putin,
So
you see
it's
no,
very simple.
no out for Putin, but
Yeah.
how does it end?
I have a very simple end for the war. The Russian forces are chased out of Ukrainian territory, and the borders are reestablished, and that includes Crimea. So that's the end of the war. Ukrainian forces will stop at the border, and we've already seen this happen. There's a wonderful video of Ukrainian forces when the front around Kharkiv collapsed, and you can see it's one of the bigger cities on the map close to the Russian border. When the front around Kharkiv collapsed, Ukrainian forces chased Russian forces in retreat up to the Russian border. And when they got to the border, it was undefended. There was this, and I don't have a comfortable word for this in English. In Russian and German, it's Schlagbaum. And the only word I can come up with is turnpike. So like if you're going to pay a toll, you come up, with your money to the toll, and there's this pole that's over the lane, and you pay your money, and then the pole goes up, right? So the Schlagbaum is that pole that goes up. And so they get to the border, and there's that Schlagbaum, that pole. And one Ukrainian officer goes around the Schlagbaum, so he's now on Russian territory, and he walks over to the side of the Schlagbaum, and he sees that there's a stop sign. Now, in Russia and in Ukraine, stop signs look like they do here in the United States. They're the red octagons with actually English letters that say stop, because the word to say stop in Russian is остановитесь. So you can't fit that, So in Russian, stop. So he picks up the stop sign, and he walks back to the Schlagbaum, and he props it up on Russian territory against the Schlagbaum, against this pole, so that Russian forces, were they to approach the border with Ukraine again, would hopefully see the sign and stop. And then he goes back on the other side, the Ukrainian side, to a round of applause from his troops. So that's how the war ends. Wow. What happens to Putin in this context? I don't know. Part of me doesn't care. The Russian forces have to get out of Ukraine. It is an extraordinarily bad precedent for any aggression to be left standing, because then any country can invade any other, and the world descends into chaos. So let us respect one another's borders.
Do you think that the Russian troops' hearts are in the war, or they're fighting half-heartedly against their own alleged citizens, Ukrainians?
So the soldiers in the Russian army, and I'm going to call them the soldiers in the armed forces of Russia, and I'm going to call them that rather than Russian soldiers, because many of them are not Russian. They're not ethnically Russian. Have no idea why they're fighting this war. Sure. They don't understand it, and they are not adequately supplied or staffed. And one of the things that's about to start happening, because Putin planned for this war to be over in 3 days when he invaded in February. Sure. And they are not prepared for winter. Wow. And here comes winter. and these guys are going to freeze to death. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians all speak Russian. You know, it doesn't make them Russian, right? So people in India all speak English, maybe not all, but many people in India speak English. It doesn't make them British, right? You tend to, around the world, speak the language of your imperial occupier.
I know I do.
Yeah. So, in this case, all the Ukrainians speak Russian. The Russians do not speak Ukrainian. So all the Ukrainians speak Russian, and there's broadcasts and there's communication on Telegram and other social media platforms to soldiers of the Russian armed forces. The headline is, "Stay alive, surrender, we will protect you."
Oh my God.
We will protect you. And so they are surrendering.
And they're mutinying.
And they're mutinying. So, ultimately this bodes for a failure of the Russian armed forces. I do not believe that Putin has a path to victory. And did I answer your second question?
No,
Let's
it's just-
assume that you did,
Yeah.
because we only have time for one more question.
Oh, okay.
If you would defer to the gentleman
I will.
behind
Thanks
you.
thanks very much.
Thank you, Jason.
Hi, Rob Dowler. So if you had to bet, how long can Russia keep this going?
I would say by the end of 2023, this will be over. That's my prediction. What is it based on? Just my gut. In terms of increasing world support for Ukraine, with every day new revelations about Russian war crimes, we're going to be learning more and more about Russian war crimes as Kherson, as more comes to light about what happened in Kherson. And by the way, the city of Mariupol, which is still under Russian occupation, was completely destroyed by Russian carpet bombing, just as the Russians did in Syria and in Chechnya. And Mariupol was 95% Russian speaking, so we need to, Putin needs to rescue the Russian speakers. When Mariupol, not if, but when Mariupol is liberated, we will find even more torture camps. And if you want to read, I'm sorry, this is gruesome, if you want to read an account of an individual who was tortured by the Ukrainian, who was tortured by the Russians, and this is before the invasion of February of this year, before the full-scale invasion, in the period of time between 2014 and that invasion, there is a book, and I think I have it here, called Paradise Camp. I'm sorry, the Torture Camp on Paradise Street. Of course, it's the bottom. No. I'm not sure I have it here, but I do have a list of books about the war in Ukraine, both literature and history, Ukrainian history, links to films, documentary and otherwise, including a fascinating documentary film made by a Russian-speaking a Russian speaker who's now in Ukraine in exile, called Severed Relations, which is interviews with family members who are no longer speaking to each other because of the war. So one is living in Ukraine, one is living in Russia, or they're both living in Russia, but they're not speaking to each other. Several families, a pair of people from each family. So that list is available for you at support.fdu.edu/Rifkin Forum.
I can't think of a better way of ending the session than with a URL. But we are out of time, so I hope you will join me in thanking Dean Rifkin for sharing his insights and experiences with us. Ben, thank you so much for being a great sport, and thank all of you for coming.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, everyone.